calculation is working and it's all fine. Just to answer your questions, so when I did my GCSEs, I did it in 2019. And thank you for the lovely comments. It means so much. So yeah, we're going to be going over GCSE geography now. So my plan is that we're going to go over the content now, and then we're going to go over the case studies and examples during the second part of the live stream. So content first and then case studies. If you have any more questions, just put them in the chat and let's get started. So first key concepts you need to know are about urbanization. So okay, let me just zoom in. So you need to know what urbanization is. So urbanization is just growth in a country. So it's a growth in the proportion of people who live in urban areas. Mhm. So urbanization, the clue is in the name, and they may ask you this, is the growth of the population of people living in urban areas. Now, around 55% of the world lives in urban areas. You don't necessarily need to know this, but just know that the majority, therefore, of the world live in urban areas, and this value is constantly increasing. So you need to know 3 key points: high income countries, low income countries, and newly emerging economies. So, what do each of these mean? So, more economically developed. For example, countries such as the UK and Japan. Now, most high income countries have already experienced urbanization. So, in high income countries, around 80% of the population live in urban areas. So, for example, in countries like the UK, 80% of the population live in urban areas. Therefore, if 80% of people already live in urban areas, this then means that the rate of urbanization, which means the rate of people moving from country and rural areas to urban areas, is quite low. So, low rates of urbanization. Now, you can think of it as the opposite in low income countries. So, in low income countries, they're less economically developed. So, countries such as Ethiopia. Or now, in countries like these, most of the population live in rural areas. So, only 30% of the population actually live in urban areas. And if a low amount of people live in urban areas, this means the rate of urbanization is high because more people are able to move. So, in terms of the actual percentages for each rate, in high income countries, the rate of urbanization is under 1%. In low income countries, the rate of urbanization is roughly up to 6%. And what about newly emerging economies? Now, what are newly emerging economies? These are countries where economic development is increasing rapidly. So they're growing, they're developing. Now, the urban population, therefore, is roughly 50%. Now, example countries include countries such as Brazil or China, where the economy is just booming. Now, their urban population is around 50%, and their rate of urbanization is 2%. Do we need these stats for the exams? Yes, we do. Thank you for your question. Okay. So that's some key, but it's not too integral to remember these because it's more about the case studies and the examples. Okay. Now, what is urbanization caused by? Urbanization is caused by rural to urban migration. This means people who are from rural areas like the countryside to urban areas and built up areas like London, for example. Now, the reason why people might move from rural to urban areas are called push factors because they push people to move to these areas. And the reason why people come so push factors are the reasons why people want to leave these rural areas, and you've got pull factors as well. Now, pull factors are the reasons why people want to come to these urban areas. So, push factors are the downsides of living in countryside and places like that, and pull factors are the upsides of living in urban areas. So, examples of push factors include maybe the lack of healthcare, the lack of facilities, the worse education, and also things like natural disasters, because natural disasters can happen in both rural or urban areas. However, they have more damaging effects to rural areas because um, they have less predictions and planning and all of those techniques to prevent things like earthquakes. And also, the movement from mechanized agricultural equipment, because there's a movement towards companies that are using, instead of having people and manufacturers, they want to then have mechanization, which is using machines and oil power and things like that. Okay. So pull factors include things like the fact that in urban areas there are more jobs. Also, in urban areas, there's better access to healthcare, there's better education. There's also benefit schemes as well, which are not necessarily as put together in rural areas. Now, urbanization isn't just caused by rural to urban migration. Urbanization is also caused by another thing called natural increase. Now, natural increase is just when a naturally younger population tend to move to these to urban areas because they go in search of jobs, in search of work. You don't tend to see the elderly moving into cities, you tend to see the elderly moving out of cities. Now, what this then causes is, since the younger population is going there, that means that the younger population are more likely to live there for a longer duration of time, and therefore they're more likely to have children as well. Now, natural increase is when the birth rate exceeds the death rate. And since the elderly are moving out and the new people are moving in, this means that the death rate in those cities are actually decreasing and the birth rate's increasing because the young people are having children. Okay. Now we're going to skip the case studies because we're going to return to them at the end. Let's move on to the next content bit, which is all about UK cities. Most cities are actually in lowland areas. So the placement of cities is very actually related to the geology. Now, what that means is that strategically, loads of cities within the UK are actually placed on flatter ground, and the flatter ground areas are tends to be found in the southern areas. Now, flatter ground is much better for buildings and infrastructure. Now, another thing we need to know about the UK cities is that the population distribution in the UK is not equal. So that means that we have an unequal population distribution. For example, in the UK, which let me attempt to draw the UK. So in the UK, the northern areas are actually quite sparsely populated, and the southern areas are very densely familiar with the term sparse and densely. Now, the reason why the northern areas were more sparsely populated and the southern areas more densely populated is because the northern areas' geology is much more hilly and mountainous. This then means that it's difficult to farm, and also more natural resources such as oil are found in the southern parts of the UK as well. Now, a lot of people forget to revise the topic about UK cities, and it's not too much to remember. You just need to be really familiar with how cities are placed in the UK. Just remember, upland regions, sparsely populated. Lowland regions are densely populated, which is why many cities are found in the southern areas. Now, the biggest city in the UK, as you should be aware of, is London. London has a population of 9 million people, and it's 16% of the total of UK's population. So 16% of the whole of the UK lives in one tiny area, London. Now, it's also important part of this topic are the different zones of the city. So, in the middle of any city, you will always have this, the Central Business District, the CBD. Now, this is usually found in the middle of a city, and most amenities, most services, most businesses, they're all found here. So, this is also often referred to as the town centre cities. Now, then you have the inner city around that. So, you have the town centre in the middle, then you have the inner city. The inner city has a mix of land use. So it's mainly residential, means mostly lots of people live in the inner city, but there are some businesses here and there are also some recreational parks. There are lots of short roads and mostly terraced housing. So you have a mix of land use, mainly residential, some businesses. Now, you then have the suburbs. The suburbs are found towards the edge of a city. These are mainly residential areas. So yeah. So you'll notice that in the inner city, they're all terraced housing because there's not much space. Whereas as you move out of the city towards the suburbs, because the house prices are much cheaper because you're moving away from all of the amenities, this means that you can also afford to have more space and more cheaper housing. So you tend to have semi-detached housing. And right on the outskirts, you have what's called the rural to urban fringe. Now, that just means when this urban city is meeting the rural outside, and this tends to be farmland and open spaces, as well as possible housing developments for the future. Okay, now moving on. Again, we're going to return to the case studies. So let's move on to sustainable urban living. Now, urban areas need to become more sustainable. But what does sustainable mean? So, sustainable means living in a way that lets people meet their needs now without compromising the needs of the future. So, basically, the current population not being overly greedy and taking out the future's share. Okay, so how can a city be sustainable? Well, one way in which cities can be sustainable is by conserving resources such as water and energy. So, conservation. So, conserving just means using as little as possible that's necessary. So, let's first start by talking about how we conserve water. So, how is water conserved? Well, firstly, it's ensured that only as much water that's taken from the environment that can be naturally replaced. So, not overly taking water that cannot be replaced by precipitation. For example, if you had a lake and if you were going to take all of the water from the lake, then that would not be sensible because the rain would not be able to replace all of the water in that lake. So only taking some of it. Now that seems obvious, so hopefully you should remember that. Another thing is what we call streams. So different methods in order to conserve water collectively. So things such as collecting rainwater. Now, if you collect this rainwater, you can then use it for things such as gardening instead of having to use the fresh water from the hose. You can also install toilets that flush less water. You'll be surprised as how much water is wasted when you flush a toilet. Also, installing water meters. Now, water meters basically tell you how much water you're wasting or you're using. It therefore reminds you what you need to stop, how much you need to stop using, and also encouraging people to use less water. Now, that's water conservation schemes. What about energy conservation schemes? So, how do we conserve energy? Well, firstly, as I'm sure you're all aware, burning fossil fuels is not sustainable because, as we know, they are not renewable, meaning they will one day run out. And also, they contribute to climate change. So, how do we ensure that there's energy conservation? By doing schemes such as, firstly, promoting renewable energy, encouraging people to make their houses more, encouraging and making sure that all homes meet a minimum energy efficiency requirements. So having certain requirements that the government are putting in place so that technically everyone in the UK is forced to have, and also ensuring that people reduce car usage by publicising and making sure that everyone is using as much public transport as possible. So those are four ways in which you can employ energy conservation. So increasing renewable energy, increasing efficiency, reducing the requirements. Now I've never seen this come up in an exam question format. However, always remember you're trying to revise it, because I remember there will always be topics that will surprise you in the geography exam. So don't think it won't come up. And water conservation, but do other things to make the city sustainable. Things such as creating green spaces. So green spaces are things such as parks or areas like green roofs. Now, be really dirty, really busy, and really hot. That is why loads of people tend to feel very stressed out, and it's an unpleasant environment. That's why green spaces are not only good for increasing sustainability, but it's also good for mental health as well. And because they are naturally cooler areas, it's also useful for relaxing in super hot areas and when times of the year where it is things like heat strokes. They also encourage people to exercise more, because if you have green spaces, it enables people to exercise. And the more people exercise, the more healthier and happier people will be. And furthermore, green spaces, the obvious advantages is things like reducing air pollution and reducing the risk of flooding. Now, you may be confused as how green spaces reduces the risk of flooding. Well, when you have a very built up area with not much green space, what happens is, in order to build this area, instead of building it straight onto the soil, they need to have a ground, and the ground has to be something like tarmac or rock. Now, because of this tarmac or rock, this means that when it's very heavy rain, instead of going through and being absorbed by the soil, it runs off. And because it is impermeable, it then floods because it groups together. Whereas if you have loads of green spaces, that means the soil is exposed and therefore the water can be absorbed, and therefore this reduces the risk of flooding. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions about this topic, feel free to ask. Now, another way to increase sustainability is by reducing or recycling the waste. So, dealing with waste by reducing it or recycling it. So, if you are recycling waste, this means that there's less raw materials that have to be taken from the ground, and the less raw materials that have to be taken, the less extraction and the less fossil fuels needed for that. So, an example could be melting metal cans. And as you melt these metal cans, these can then be converted into something else instead of going to landfill. So it also reduces landfill. Now, why is landfill bad? Because landfill is unsustainable, as it wastes resources that could be recycled, and eventually there'll just be nowhere left to bury the waste because it takes years and years and years to decompose. Now, there's also things such as waste recycling schemes, like schemes. This an example of waste recycling schemes is things such as curbside collections. So when you have a road, certain areas have boxes outside which allow them to put things that need to be recycled or things that could be recycled. For example, metal cans that have been used. And what happens is different companies can take this and recycle it and turn it into something useful. So that's an example of a curbside collection. So if you search up right now the website FreeCycle, this allows people to offer free things that can be used by others instead of putting it in the waste and wasting it in the bin. Now, There's one more way in which sustainability can be ensured in cities, and that is through traffic management. So, traffic congestion from cars and lorries causes a lot of problems. Now, we can split these problems up into three main groups. Obviously, the main is going to be environmental, but they also cause economic issues and social issues. So, in terms of environmental, issues that traffic causes is things like air pollution, which then leads to the release of loads of greenhouse gases that can cause climate change. So, you've got air pollution, which leads to an increase in greenhouse gases, which then leads to an increase in the rate of climate change. In terms of economic issues and problems, congestion can actually make people late for work. And if they're late for work, that means that they are then delayed and it delays deliveries. It could then cause companies to lose money. And some social issues is that there's actually a higher chance of accidents when there's high traffic. And that means that it could risk people's lives. And also, it's not very good for the mental health because traffic causes lots of frustration and road rage. And also for the health of pedestrians. A couple of years ago, the first ever death that happened in the UK happened in a certain area due to them inhaling the greenhouse gases just from the road because they were asthmatic. So it's becoming a real social problem in terms of the health of pedestrians as well. So that's enough of the problems. How do we manage it? How do we solve this issue? Traffic management. So, firstly, the main thing that may have come to your mind is public transport. Now, urban transport strategies encourage people to use public transport instead of travelling by car. Many of these have happened in London. Now, this isn't an example or a case study, but it's just something you need to know as part of your content. So, one scheme is called the DLR. Now, if you live close to or in London, you may be familiar with this. This is the Docklands Light Railway. Now, this is actually an automatic train system. This automatic train system connects the east of London to the city centre. It operates mostly on tracks above the street level, and it actually is so useful because it connects 120 million people. So it's used by 120 million people per year or per annum. Now, another example of a scheme used in London is the underground system. So, the London Underground. Now, the London Underground is a network of the ways to take people off the roads, and it actually takes 3 million people off the roads every day. Which has a massive impact. Imagine 3 million people off the roads each and every single day. So we've talked about the DLR, we've talked about the underground. There's also things such as self-service bikes. Now these can be electric bikes or these can be just normal regular bikes, and they are actually the cheapest form of public transport, and they also provide things such as bicycle lanes in London to allow people to travel using this self-service bike system. Now, the final public transport thing that you can remember about London are oysters. So depending on where you live and where you're watching this, Oyster cards are really good because they allow people to travel on most of London's public transport network without having to buy separate tickets. Now, this means that it actually reduces the waste of buying tickets. So that's one way of using public transport. Another way of managing traffic is also through managing and monitoring the traffic flow. So, how do we manage and monitor the traffic flow? Well, there are four main ways. The first way is congestion charge. So, congestion charge is this charge that you have to pay now in certain areas. For example, when you're entering London, in order to, because of the fact that you're using a car, and it's almost that you're paying for the contribution of climate change that you're adding. And therefore, because of congestion charge, it dissuades people from using. So the opposite of persuades, it dissuades people from using cars, and it persuades people to use public transport. Now, another method used is bus priority lanes. Now, if there's lots of traffic, then a lot of people on the public transport that happens on roads, such as buses, will still get delayed and affected, even though they are making a better choice. So, bus priority lanes allow those people who are making a better choice by taking public transport to take precedence and therefore stop them from being late in the traffic. Therefore, it attracts people to use public transport because it gives them leverage, as they won't be late for work and they won't be stuck in a traffic jam. Another method used is parking restrictions. Now, parking restrictions make sure that parked cars do not block the traffic flow. So they're just certain measurements that are taken into place. And finally, ring roads. Now, if you don't know what ring roads are, these are just pedestrianised shopping streets that keep traffic away from the city centre, therefore ensuring that all of the pedestrians have a much safer experience. Now, that is the end of topic 2A, so moving on to topic 2B. Now, remember, we just went over the content, so we'll be going over the case studies and examples after we've gone through the content of paper 2. Okay, so moving on to topic 2B. So, topic 2B is the changing economic world. And the first thing we need to know is measuring development. So, how is development measured? So, development, what does development mean firstly? So, development is the economic growth and the progress in economic growth, use of technology, and improve of welfare. So there's three main things that development means. So the development is the progress of each of these three things. The progress of firstly the economic growth, the progress of the technology, and the progress of the welfare of those living in that country. So it's not necessarily limited to just economic growth, it's all of these three factors here: economic growth, technology usage, and the welfare of those living in that country. So when a country develops, it basically gets better for the people living there. So the welfare directly links to improving the quality of life for people. Now let's look at the measures of development. There's a lot of measures of development. some of them not necessarily as good as others because it allows companies and companies and countries to manipulate the data. So you have GNI. GNI stands for gross national income. So this is the total value of all of the goods and all of the services that are produced by a country. So everything that is sold and all of the services that are sold from a country, that is known as the GNI, the total value. So this is practically a measure of wealth. Then you have GNI per head, which is just meaning the total GNI, so the total amount of goods and services sold, therefore the total profits of a country divided by the population of the country. So imagine in the UK, everything sold and all of the services sold, there's a total money divided by the population of the UK. Now, this is very misleading because it suggests that everyone has an equal contribution to the GNI, whereas we know that some people have a higher contribution and some people have a low contribution. Now, other methods and other measures include things like birth rate and death rate. So in the 2022 exam, they actually asked to define birth rate and death rate, and you need to know how to actually define it. So the birth rate is the number of live births, so not stillbirths, the number of live births per thousand of the population per year. So let's go through that again. Birth rate is the number of live births per thousand of the population per year. Now, the death rate is really similar. So the death rate is the number of deaths per thousand people of the population per year. Now, you need to also realize the difference that birth rate is not the same as infant mortality rate. As we said, birth rate is the number of live births per thousand people of the population per year. Infant mortality rate just means what are the chances of an infant, so someone under 1 year old, dying. So in terms of the definition, it's the number of babies below the age of 1 year old dying before they become 1. So dying before the age of 1 per thousand babies born. So you need to know that birth rate is just the number of live births per thousand people, whereas infant mortality is the number of births before the age of 1 per thousand babies. Now, there's other methods such as literacy rate, access to safe water, life expectancy. So life expectancy is just the average age a person can expect to live to. Okay. Now let's keep going in measuring development. So looking at measuring development, let's look at the different types of countries. So we remember there's high-income countries, low-income countries, and newly emerging economies. You may be asked to describe how any of these factors here are in one of these three. So how is the GNI in a high-income country? How is the birth rate in a newly emerging economy? So let's look in depth at these countries. So in high-income countries, what does it just mean? High-income countries just means that these are very wealthy countries. The UK is included in this. very wealthy countries, and this then means that the GNI of these countries is very high. Lower income countries, they're poorest countries. And because they're the poorest countries, they have a very low GNI. Then you have newly emerging economies. So, in a newly emerging economy, this is where the wealth does not stay the same. So, they are rapidly getting richer as their economy moves. So, there's basically lots of economic growth, and therefore the economic growth then leads to development as the quality of life increases and the multiplier effect takes place. Their economy therefore moves and transitions from a primary industry. And remember, primary is things like getting the natural resources. So mining, a secondary industry. So manufacturing, turning these raw materials into products. And we've definitely seen this change and shift in countries such as China. Now, these countries have different names for them. So, in terms of newly emerging economies, oh, I'm so sorry, I mixed these two up. So, that is a newly emerging economy. That is a low income. In a newly emerging economy, it's also important that you may see this BRICS. Now, BRICS just stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But you might also see MINT as well. So MINT stands for Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. Now you will note that all of these countries are newly emerging economies. You don't need to know them off by heart or anything, it just gives you an idea of what a country is. Now, a key measure of development that you definitely need to be aware of is called HDI. Because it combines the things together. So hopefully you will know that HDI stands for the Human Development Index. Now, this measure avoids some of the problems of using only the GNI to define a country or only the birth rate to define how a country is developing, because it's a mixture of loads of different values. So, what it is a mixture of GNI per head, which is an economic life expectancy, which is a social measure. And finally, it's also a mixture of education level, which again is a social factor. So by combining the economic factor of GNI with the social factors of life expectancy and education level, you get a more unbiased view, which is really helpful for looking at countries' development. So HDI is a value found between 0 and 1. So the closer it is to 0, the least developed it is, which means the lower GNI, the lower the life expectancy, and the lower the education level. But the closer it is to 1, that means it has a higher GNI, it has a higher life expectancy, and it has a higher education level. Now let's move on. Another thing that hasn't been too in the exams, but that makes it all the reason to revise it because it might come up this year. So the DTM, demographic transition model. So what is a demographic transition model. So what it is it shows the birth rates, the death rates, and death rate affect the population growth. Now you might be thinking, of course, it's obvious to see how the birth rate affects the population and the death rate affects the population. But remember, you need to be really careful about this because the purpose of this is to not just talk about the population, but the growth of the population. So populations overall change and overall they increase. However, does the birth rate and death rate cause any fluctuation in this? So let's look at the stages of the demographic transition model. So there are 5 stages. Now, the more you progress to the 5th stage, the more developed of a country you are. Now, these tend to be based on population pyramids as well. It might actually be more beneficial to just refer to one larger graph. Thank you for the compliment. I'm glad you're finding this helpful. So it might be easier to actually just refer to one graph and show the stages like that. So this first line is going to show the population size. So eventually in stage 1, so stage 1 tends to be where there is a low population size. And then in stage 2, you progress to a rise in the population, and this continues in stage 3. And then in stages 4 and 5, it flattens out again. And there's actually a bit of a population decrease. Now, the reason why we say that as you go this way, there's increasing development is because it actually matches it. So the population is quite low. Well, initially in all countries, the population is quite low. The birth rate is high and fluctuating, and the death rate is also high but fluctuating. The population is low because there's not many health accessories in order to help those people to ensure that there's a low infant mortality rate. So stage 1 is the least developed. And very few places are actually at stage 1 now because obviously we've evolved and we have healthcare to ensure that there is a low infant mortality rate. But there are some countries that are still in stage 1. That means that there is a high infant mortality rate and also a high birth rate and a high death rate. Now, in stages 2, you can tend to see that there's a much higher birth rate. Now, the reason why the birth rate is high is because there's a lack of contraception. So the first reason why it's high is because there's a lack of contraception and also education and awareness. And another reason why it's high is because the economy is in these countries is then based on agriculture. And therefore, the more people working and helping out with the agriculture, the easier it is. So people would have more children in order to help out with agriculture. That's why the birth rate is quite high in stages 2. But the life expectancies actually increase because the healthcare is improving and therefore the death rates decrease. And that's stages 2. Stage 3 is more developed. So most newly emerging economies are at stage 3, so in the middle. Now, newly emerging economies is when the birth rate starts to fall, The reason why the birth rate starts to fall in countries like China is because they place restrictions, and also there's use of contraception, and more women are working instead of having children. So they allow women to work. So lower birth rates. And also, the economy is changing from primary to secondary. So people are moving from farming to manufacturing. Therefore, it's no longer of use to have loads of children because there are more mouths to feed. Therefore, people are reducing that. And also, there's improved healthcare, which means there's just a lower death rate as well. Then in stages 4 and 5, these are the most developed high income countries. So both of these are high income countries, such as the UK. So I don't know if you knew this, but in the UK, the population is actually falling. So the population is falling because people are having less kids, because it's getting more expensive to raise children, and the standard of living is also very high. And because the standard of living is high, this means that less people get to have this high standard of living. Now, okay. So, and also healthcare is good in high income countries. Now, Japan is an example of an area where there is natural population increase, but it's falling at a very drastic rate because most of the population in Japan is very elderly. But that is another case study to look at afterwards. So, let's then move on to uneven development and what things cause uneven development. So, have you ever wondered why some countries are richer and some countries are poorer? Well, you may know the reasons to some of them, and feel free to put them in the chat as well. So, firstly, we're going to split up the reasons why there's uneven country development into three main reasons. Firstly, physical factors. Secondly, economic factors. And finally, historical factors. Now, all of these mean that some countries are richer and some countries are poorer. So let's look at them in detail. So, physical includes things like a poor climate. Now, what this means is that because there's a poor climate, for example, if it's really hot, or it's really cold, or it's really dry, this just means not much will grow. And because not much will grow, this means that there's low food production, and low food production leads to malnutrition. Now, malnutrition then means that people have a lower quality of life. Now, another reason why physical factors are bad is because of poor farming land. Now, this is all based on luck, really. And if the land in a country is steep, or if the soil is really poor and really infertile, then you're also going to struggle to produce food. And again, malnutrition problem happens again. Another reason why is because of few raw materials. So when you think of few raw materials, you need to think that countries such as the Middle East are very lucky, those governments there, because they are very lucky and fortunate that they have so many oil reserves and gas reserves, which makes them a very wealthy country. However, on the other hand, some countries, like loads of countries in Africa, for example, they don't have many raw materials and therefore there's nothing to export. So they have nothing to sell and therefore they make less money. And if they make less money, they have less money to spend on development projects. And then final reason for physical factors is natural disasters. If certain countries are affected more by natural disasters than others, then that means that those countries have to spend more money trying to fix the debris, instead of development into the future. Now let's look at economic factors that cause uneven development. So economic factors include things like poor trade links. So trade is just the exchange of goods. And what this means is that world trade patterns, so countries that trade with other countries, tend to influence a country's economy and so affects its level of development. So if a country has really poor trade links, then it won't really make lots of money and it won't really get lots of things as well. For example, the UK used to have a really good relationship with the EU, but of course, because of Brexit, it's literally broken that. But before, because of this really good relationship, that means that we would have a really good trade relationship. Whereas other countries may have really bad trade relationships, which means it's harder to sell things. Now, another reason for economic issues is things like an economy based on primary products. So, just the countries tend to focus on primary products. So, things like fishing, farming, agriculture, chopping wood, getting metal. And this is very limiting. Because of this, it means that they make less money, because if you're exporting wood, that actually makes less money than if you were to export a final product. And remember, final product is manufacturing, and manufacturing is the secondary industry. But because they're in the first industry, that means that they're prone to making a low amount of money unless they have really, really cheap labor. Now, the final economic reason is debt. Countries may be in debt for loads of different reasons. Very poor countries have to borrow money and they're never going to pay it back. And the worst thing is, because they have to constantly pay all the money they have back to those countries, that then means that they have very little money for development. Now, finally, the last reason for the causes of uneven development is historically. So, colonization is a massive reason why some countries are richer than other countries. Mainly the European countries have a massive advantage, um, even in the modern times, because of colonialism. So, countries that were colonized are often at a lower development level. For example, if you look at a country like India, before colonization, so pre colonization, it was actually the richest country in the world. And then when Britain came in, then and when Britain left as well, because of partition and things like that, India then became one of the poorest countries. So clearly you can see how colonialism has had a massive impact from one of the richest to one of the poorest countries. Now, I'm sure you can think of loads of examples of Britain and other countries colonizing other countries. And what happens is, as they go in, it's at higher development, and when they leave, it's at lower development. And the European countries that have colonized Asia, Africa, Australasia, and the Americas, which happened between the 16th and the 20th century, because of all of this, they removed all of the raw materials like gold, like silver, and this meant that all of the profits went to the colonizers instead of the people living there. So, impact, and the historical reason is also war. So during war, especially civil war, this actually reduces the development because money is being spent on arms and guns and things like that. And also, a lot of damage is done to infrastructure. So instead of actually developing, you're going backwards in terms of development because you have to fix all of the things that are being broken and destroyed. For example, in Syria, they are experiencing a crisis because the development is at such low levels and yet war continues. Okay, so now after looking at all of the reasons for uneven development, So what does it cause? The consequences of uneven development. So there are three main factors that uneven development causes. So the first being wealth. The second being health. And the third being international migration. So these three things are consequences of uneven development. So uneven development leads to a difference in all of these things. So let's first look at wealth. So people in more developed countries tend to have a higher income than those in less developed countries. For example, the GNI in the UK is 40 times the GNI in a country like Chad, which is crazy. Therefore, that means that those people living in the UK, so you viewers, you have a 40 times better quality of life than those people living in Chad. Now, uneven development can also cause big inequalities in within the countries as well. So, if you look at a country like Kenya, for example, in Kenya, the richest 10% earned on average 23 times the poorest 10%. So, wealth not only causes disparities in terms of income between countries, but also disparities within countries as well. And as we've talked about, it also affects people's standard of living because if you have less money, then that means that you tend to have a worse quality of life because you have a lower standard of living, because you can't afford goods and services that mean that your lives can be as comfortable and as convenient. Now, the second thing, health. So, healthcare is actually much more developed in countries like high income countries. So, you have a more developed healthcare. Now, this therefore has a direct impact on the amount of people who live. And it also means that diseases such as malaria, which are treatable, have more of a devastating impact in lower income countries because of the fact that there's a lower healthcare because of the money. And also, this then means, as we said, you have a longer life expectancy if you live in countries like the UK. You have a lower infant mortality rate. And also the adequate healthcare whilst you're surviving, as we've talked about diseases. And finally, international migration. So this might be a more difficult one in terms of these three consequences of uneven development. But what it just means is that when you have these high income countries at very high economic positions, and then imagine a mountain. So at the bottom, you have the low income countries, and in the middle, you have these newly emerging economies. And they're all climbing towards trying to improve and develop. Now, what happens is sometimes it takes too long. So the people start migrating. So people from the low income countries and the newly emerging economies start to migrate towards the high income countries in order to improve their prospects. Prospects in terms of jobs, better education. So, if your parents or your grandparents were immigrants, you might understand this system and how you may have had to come here. But other reasons why people move from low income countries to high income countries includes things like conflict as well and war, escaping war zones. Now, migrant workers contribute a lot to the economies of high income countries, but some people believe that they um, take the jobs so that the people actually in the country don't have any jobs. But there's always enough jobs, so that argument is counted quite quickly. But because of the migrant workers contributing a lot to the high income country, this then means that the low income country has a lower economy. Because if the higher income country is getting richer because of the migrant workers, the lower income country is only losing out, and this gap between the development is only increasing and widening. That's why some people have to send money back to their homes and back to their original countries so that they try to reduce this development gap. Now, we've looked at unequal development and uneven development. So, how do we solve these? There's a couple of methods in which they aim to reduce the global development gap. So, let's look at them now. Also, do tell me if I'm going too fast or too slow, or if you have any questions, feel free to tell me in the chat. And also if you have any videos that you would want me to do. Okay, so reducing the global development gap. So there's actually 7 different ways we can reduce the global development gap. Now, in an exam situation, if you're asked about ways to reduce this, you don't have to talk about all 7. As long as you remember possibly between 3 to 5 of them, you will definitely be fine. But I'm going to go through all 7 so that you have the choice of picking which ones you prefer. So the first way is through investment. So there's things called FDIs, which is foreign direct investment. This is when you have people or companies in one country that buys properties or invests in infrastructure in another. Now, FDI actually leads to much better access to finance, to technology, and to expertise, as well as improved infrastructure and industry and increases in services. So, with FDI, this just means that companies, like rich companies such as Apple, invests in typically poorer countries like newly emerging economies or low income countries, and they do this by investing in infrastructure or investing in property. And what this does is this improves the development of that country by not having to cause debt to that country, but it also is a win-win situation because they are investing, they can also gain some money. So FDIs are really good because they then give people and locals better access to finance and technology, which they wouldn't have got just based off of their own economy, and therefore they also have job prospects. So investment is really cool. Another key good method is aid. So this can be money. Let me do it in another color. This could be things like money, resources, medicine, food. This is given to a country by charities or foreign governments. And the money tends to be used for development projects, for example, for constructing schools, for constructing dams, and providing farming knowledge. For example, you can see that the UK actually gave Sudan 180 million one year in order to help improve the area and also fund 17 different projects. So aid can definitely help, but there is one limitation to aid, and that is corruption. So countries with corrupt governments, which is a lot of low-income countries, tend to actually, instead of using the money towards aiding the general public, they actually take it for themselves. So that's why aid isn't necessarily good, and maybe investment might be better. Now, another method is fair trade. Fair trade is a development gap. Now, I'm pretty sure you should be aware of what fair trade is. So it's ensuring that farmers in local income countries are getting that fair price for the goods that they are producing. Now, you've probably seen this with coffee or banana or chocolate or cocoa. Now, companies who want to sell their products that are labeled as fair trade will then want to pay the producers. So this is fair because you're balancing the needs of the producers with the much more richer consumers. And this is all done through the use of companies. So companies enable the producers to be paid fairly by increasing the price for the richer consumers. Now, another disadvantage with this is that even though a company may claim to be fair trade, it may still not be fair trade, and only perhaps a tiny proportion of the money actually reaches the producers in the end because of the corruption in between. Now, we've talked about three of the methods, and let's talk about the fourth method. So the fourth method is intermediate technology. So intermediate tech basically includes tools, machines, systems, things that improve the quality of life, but are also really simple for the locals to use and also affordable. So things like solar powered lights. Now, solar powered lights are really useful because what they do is, especially in a countries like Nepal, they allow people to get free electricity. It's easy to use because you have to just put it out in the sun, and it can allow those people to study and read at in darker times, and therefore they can learn certain skills. So solar power has been really beneficial, and it's again a really simple way in order to enforce this. Now, another method is microfinance loans. So, microfinance loans are just a specific type of loan. So, when there are really poor people, then companies tend to give them loans because they don't think that they will be able to pay it back. Therefore, microfinance loans are given to people in low income countries, for example, people in slums or favelas, um, and it enables them to start their own businesses and become financially independent. So it's really important in giving, people who don't tend to have access opportunity to start businesses and become financially independent. Now, you will probably, if you research microfinance loans, you may see a lot of these for women, allowing women to kickstart their own independent, even though they may have been refused a loan from the bank, for example. Now, another way is industrial development. So, industrial development just includes ensuring that countries that are poorer tend to do agriculture. So, developing the industry from primary to secondary, so from farming to manufacturing, it boosts the GNI because instead of exporting wood, you're exporting a desk, for example, and a desk has much more value. So not only are you getting a higher GNI, but you're also allowing the workers to become more skilled, which improves job prospects. And the final method for reducing the global development gap is debt relief. So, debt is just when a country owes another country. And debt relief is when all of or some of a debt is cancelled for a country, or the interest rates are lowered. For example, where this was used was Zambia. So Zambia had a 4 billion US dollar debt, and this was all cleared. So this is all gone. This means that it lifted a massive weight off their shoulders, and they didn't have to pay back this debt, and instead they actually turned the money into giving free healthcare. So this shows a really positive example of how debt relief can improve the development, as it has helped so many people in that country to survive simple and treatable diseases. Okay, we're now going to look at economic development in the UK, and then that will be the end of 2B topic. Well done for lasting this long, and feel free to ask any questions if you have any. Okay. So we're now looking at economic development in the UK. So the UK's economy has changed over the past couple of decades. So it used to be based on manufacturing. So the economy used to be based on manufacturing and things like working in factories, working to build things, build cars. However, since the 1960s, there has been a transition onto the tertiary and quaternary sectors. So, tertiary and quaternary. So, tertiary sectors are basically services. For example, being a fireman, being a policeman, being a teacher. And quaternary tends to be things like science and tech. So, overall, the UK has made this shift from the manufacturing industries to the tertiary and quaternary industries. Now, there's been a couple of reasons why this has happened, and you may be asked about these in your exam. So, let's begin by looking at them. Before we begin by looking at them, you may need to know a couple of statistics as to how the UK's economy is right now compared to how it was before. So as of 2017, all of these stats are from 2017. We have a lot of the UK's population works in services. So things like retail, working in shops, things like working in entertainment. Now, services employs 4 million people in the UK. We also have a lot of people in IT in the UK. 607,000 people. You also see people into finance, especially in the cities. And it's home to many of the global financial institutions like HSBC. So the global centre for HSBC can be found in London. You also see another key sector in the UK, which is research. So lots of research happens in universities because obviously the world famous universities of Oxford and Cambridge are found here. And in 2016, 33 billion was spent on research and development. So a lot of money is being fueled into research and development. And I don't know if you've heard, but you can definitely talk about the recent advances in AI, especially in Western countries like the UK. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about some statistics. We need to talk about why has there been this shift from manufacturing industries to tertiary and quaternary industries. So why has there been this shift? So the main reason is deindustrialization. So deindustrialization is because of when the UK's industrial base had started to decline. So the UK's industry really started to incline as we had things like the UK creating loads of products, creating wool, creating fibres, creating fabrics, and loads of things. However, it started to decline because of, firstly, automation. Machinery started coming around, and machinery took the place of a lot of jobs. So, because there was a lot of job losses, this meant that there was no point having the secondary sectors anymore, and also another reason of deindustrialization in the UK is because other countries started to offer these services much cheaper. For example, China and as well as India, they offer really cheap labor. So companies thought, should I stay in the UK and pay for really expensive and higher salaries, or should I get my manufacturing done in other countries where it's much cheaper, and they decided to do that. So therefore there caused a lot of job losses, and there weren't many space in the UK for the secondary industry. Now, another reason why there was economic change was because of globalization. So, a lot of the manufacturing, as we discussed already, had moved overseas where there were lower labor costs. Now, some TNCs, so if you don't know what TNCs are transnational corporations. Now, some of these had moved some of their tertiary and quaternary operations to the UK. So, what that means is massive worldwide companies started to move their tertiary and quaternary, so their services, their helplines, and their research bases into the UK. For example, Apple. So instead of Apple thinking, let me start making a manufacturing factory in the UK where they can make the phones, they thought, no, that would be too expensive. So instead, they actually put places like their research facilities and Apple where they can sell things. So instead of having to pay the workers, they're actually getting money by people buying these Apple products. Apple employs roughly 6,500 people within the UK as of 2016. And another reason for globalization having an effect on economic change is because of the trade. Now, as the UK became more global and traded more with countries as an equal, um, this meant that they had to rely less on themselves, more on taking exports. Now, the third reason for the change in the economy is government policies. So, what that means is that the government made certain decisions that um, gave businesses certain advantages. For example, in the 1980s, there were loads of key manufacturing industries, and they had actually been owned by the government. So, in the 1980s, there were loads of factories, and all of these factories were owned by the government. But what happened was a process called privatization. Now, because of this privatization, which meant that the government sold all of these factories to different companies. Now, the government cares more about the people of the UK, but companies only care about one thing: economic profit. And if they're not making profit in the UK, they will move their factories whether they like it or not. So the factories decided, no, I'm instead going to cause, I'm instead going to waste less money, and instead of getting workers to make things in the UK where it was more expensive, they started to have manufacturing in cheaper countries like China. So through this process of privatization, it meant that job losses occurred more because because these companies cared less about the welfare of the people and more about their economic profit. Now, privatization wasn't the only government policy. You also see another government policy called deregulation. Now, don't worry, you don't need to know the exact terms and understand all of the terms. But what deregulation meant was that they removed all of these restrictions, taxes on businesses. So it encouraged businesses and entrepreneurs to actually move to the UK. So deregulation just meant that they reduced the amount of taxes on these companies. And it was only on certain companies, such as Apple and tech companies. So it basically made UK look like a really attractive base for tech, which caused this change. Now, those are the main reasons for economic change. So we talked about government policies, deindustrialization in the UK, and globalization. Now we need to look at economic development in the UK. So the industry can have lots of effects, and it tends to unfortunately have loads of negative effects on the environment. Now, some of these negative effects include things like factories producing pollutants into the atmosphere, them using fossil fuels, climate change. Also, factories using lots of energy and lots of water as well. Now, modern industrial developments are actually much more environmentally sustainable. Now, I know I wasn't just going to discuss examples and case studies necessarily right now, but I'll just give you one example. So, there's the Unicorn Group. Now, the Unicorn Group is a group of manufacturers found and based in Northern Ireland. And what they do is they are a manufacturing group of manufacturers that claim that they are 100% um, getting their electricity from renewable resources, and that they are quite sustainable. So they use biomass, they use solar energy, they use loads of different renewable energies, and therefore they reduce waste. So that's all you need to know about that example. So the Unicorn Group is an example of an industry that actually reduces the pollutants, reduces the fossil fuel, reduces the wastage by being really sustainable and getting 100% of their electricity from renewable sources. Okay, now the UK and its transport network needs to be known. So we looked at the transport network of London in the previous topic, but you need to know the transport network of the UK. So if you think of forms of transport in the UK, what would you think of? So because that is practically what you need to know. So there's four main methods of transport. And the first, or not necessarily the first, but they include things like road, railway, which is just trains, airports, so air travel, and also ports. So those are the four main transport methods and ways in which people transport in the UK: through road, through railway, through airports, and through ports. So let's talk a little bit about each of them now. You don't need to know a massive amount. So for road, the capacity on motorways is always being increased in certain areas. And this and also motorways are being transformed into what you call smart motorways. You may have heard of this term before. So smart motorways is basically when they have extra lanes, and this then means that there's much more space. Now, railway is a massive form of public transport, and that's why a lot of money is being put in terms of transport in the UK in order to develop railway. So you may have heard of the project Crossrail. So Crossrail increases the capacity of central London's trains, so central London, by 10% because it has loads of different. Okay, so the Crossrail is one method, firstly, sorry, and the second method is actually HS2. So both of these are proposals, they haven't actually been started working on either. And both of these are used to connect places like London, Birmingham, Leeds, and Manchester. So Birmingham and Manchester are northern areas, and they tend to be, it's very difficult for them to reach London, the city, but through HS2, it enables them to reach them. And just going over airports and ports, so the government has agreed to have a new runway at Heathrow. And believe it or not, just by this one new runway, this allows 700 extra planes a day. So this maximizes the air travel because the UK government benefits a lot. However, the negatives is that it will increase noise pollution, and people who live in the area of Heathrow will want to not live there. And finally, ports. So things like the London Gateway. This handles the world's largest container ships, so they're increasing the sizes of the ports, which means that it has the increased exports and imports, and therefore a greater amount of UK economy. Just with your question, do I have any techniques on revising information? So, I would say the most important thing about revising is understanding, because if you understand something, you tend to remember it better. But I definitely understand that some things are difficult to remember, and even if you understand it. So what I would say is blurting. Blurting is definitely the best way. So just get a piece of paper and write as much as you can. Even if you think you don't know much, you actually shock yourself with how much you know. And then you check, you see what you've missed, and make a list of what you've missed, and then go through those again and review this information. And then the next time you blurt it out, you probably will hopefully include them. If not, you just keep repeating this. So I hope that's a helpful method. If anyone else has any helpful methods for revising, feel free to share. Yeah. Okay. So now let's talk about the links to other countries. The UK's links. So the UK has some really strong links to other countries. It's connected to the wider world in many ways. And not just in terms of transport, but transport is definitely one of them. So, one way in which the UK is connected to the wider world is through transport. So, things like the Channel, which allows you to go to France in a very direct way, providing a route to mainland Europe as well as France, and also large airports, which act as an international hub. Now, another method of UK links is things like trade. So the UK trades globally. It doesn't just trade within Europe. It also does, although there's a lot of imports, there's lots of exports as well. So the UK exports $160 billion worth of things. If we learn about Stratford and the Olympic Park, do we need to learn about the London Docklands? So which case study and example is this for? That one depends. So I'm going to be going over the case studies and examples, so maybe you'll be able to answer your question later, but I'm a bit confused because in paper 3, there are some people who study the Olympic Park, so it actually does depend on what you're studying, but I'll come back to that question in a second if that's okay. So, trade. So, the UK trades globally. The third way in which the UK has really strong links to other countries is through culture. So the UK is known for colonizing loads of different areas, and the UK has a very strong creative industry because of the fact that loads of people had migrated to UK, and therefore there's a lot of culture in the UK. For example, things like Shaun the Sheep. Shaun the Sheep was made by animation in Bristol, and now it's shown in 170 countries. Another method of the UK having a very strong link to other countries is electronic communications. So, what does electronic communications mean? This just means telephones and the internet, and this just makes it really easy for people to communicate to other countries, and it strengthens the UK's overseas links. If you wanted to know the exact the name of the electronic communication cables, a really important one is the transatlantic cables. And this allows us to communicate with Europe as well as with the USA, and um, it's rooted via the UK. Yes, Sean. Okay. Now, the UK has formed loads of economic and political links with loads of countries as well. So, the European Union, well, even though it's left it now, you can still reference it. So, the EU is an economic and political partnership. So, it includes 27 countries, now 26, because England is not included in this. Um, and goods and people can move freely between the EU countries, strengthening the links. You also have Commonwealth. So a lot of people are confused with the concept of Commonwealth. So what is Commonwealth? Commonwealth is an association of and these 54 states include the UK and many of the UK's former colonies, and it promotes cooperation between the member countries. So, when countries say they want to leave the Commonwealth, that also means that they do not want the king at this point in time to be their head of state as well. So, they want more independence. So, it comes with advantages in terms of trade and sport, but disadvantages again in terms of having to be ruled by a colony. Okay, now you also need to know north-south divide. So the north-south divide is prevalent in the UK. Now you need to actually know an example for the north-south divide. So let's just look at, even though I said we'll be looking at examples and case studies later on, this sometimes isn't classified as an example, it's classified as content everyone needs to know. So I'm going to go through it as if it's normal content. So, what is the north south divide? So, the north south divide is the idea that in countries such as the UK, there is a difference and a disparity in terms of the economic and the social development in the northern areas in comparison to the southern areas. And sometimes it works out that the northern areas are richer than the southern areas, for example. But in the UK, it tends to be that the southern areas are more predominantly cities and therefore much richer than the northern areas. So let's look at some examples. So here's an example. So we will be comparing an area of population decline, which is South Lake Cumbria, which is classified as a northern area, so South Lakeland, Cumbria. And then you're going to be comparing this to an area of population growth. In this case, we are going to be looking at North Somerset. So North Somerset is found in the southwest of England, and Cumbria is a rural county found in the northwest of England. So socioeconomic inequalities within a country. Yes, that's right. Okay. North-south divide, socioeconomic differences within country within areas. So let's look at some differences. So in South Lakeland, Cumbria is a rural area, and also North Somerset is a rural area. South Lakeland is found in the northwest of England, whereas North Somerset is found in the southwest of England. So northwest versus southwest. So it's really good that we have the idea that they're both rural. So we're trying to compare them as similarly as possible. Now, the Cumbria includes things like the Lake District, if you've ever been there, and it's a district in the south of the country that also includes lots of boroughs such as the Barrow in Furness. Now, the population of South Lakeland had decreased by 0.8%. So, as we're talking about population decline, it decreased by 0.8% between a decade. So, between 2005 and 2015, it decreased by 0.8%. Now, the reason why is because of a decline in jobs. So, there was a decline in agriculture, and most of the people who lived in this area worked in agriculture. So, because of this decline, this meant that there were less jobs, and people were forced to move out. So, decline in agriculture, decline in jobs, which meant that people were forced to have to move out to other areas where there were jobs. Also, there was a decline in manufacturing. So, it wasn't just the primary industries, it was also the secondary industries that were declining in this area. So, both of these being in decline. Now, what caused the population increase in North Somerset? So, what happened was actually between the same years, so between 2005 and 2015, the population of North Somerset grew by 7.8%. So a massive growth in comparison to the decline in South Lakeland. Now, the reason why is because loads of people had actually moved to towns and villages that had easier access to the centre of Bristol. So people wanted to move to Bristol and town centre. And therefore, North Somerset was an area that was both quite rural but also had access to these facilities. Now, population decline has economic impacts. So, in terms of the area of South Lakeland, Cumbria, it was actually very bad because all of the shops were closing. Even massive shops like Marks and Spencer's were suffering and at risk of closure. And because everything was closing, this then meant that again there was a very low employment rates, and it also affected the local economy. It also had social impacts. So, on top of this economic impact of the closure of shops and the employment, it had social impacts. So, younger people left the area, which meant that most of the area was full of the elderly generation. So, as the young people left, this meant that the area was full of older people. And unfortunately, because there were so many old people, that they actually had a strain on medical services and social care and old people's homes. They were unable to look after them because there's actually less people to look after them. So they strained the medical services. So there was a massive impact on population decline. Now, in North Somerset, there were economic impacts, but there were positive impacts. So the house prices rose actually. Now, this is both a good thing for the people selling the houses, but I guess more difficult for those trying to buy, trying to buy the thing. I've noticed there's inappropriate language in the chat. Is the person able to be removed? I'll try to remove that. I just didn't want to interrupt. Just bear with me with a second. Okay, sorry for that. I was just removing that. Okay, just going back to that. So, thank you for telling me, by the way. I didn't even realize. Um, so yeah, and then house prices increased in North Somerset. That's So house prices increased, and it actually put a lot of strain because of the population increase. This meant that lots of people were living together, and there was also less space. So it was more congested. It put strain on public transport because loads of people were in the area. Also, loads of schools were oversubscribed, which meant that because they were oversubscribed, there wasn't enough space, and therefore they had to actually try and build more schools to cater to that new population increase. So that's all you need to know about that. And now moving on to evidence of the north-south divide. So depending on where you live in the UK, you may actually experience the effects of this. So here are some evidence of the north-south divide. Okay, so, evidence of the North South decline. Now, because of the decline of heavy industries such as manufacturing and primary industries, this has actually had a worse impact on the northern areas as opposed to the southern areas. So, the reason why is because when loads of factories were being built, a lot of the factories were being built in the northern areas. The reason why was because in the southern areas, there was no space for the factories because they tended to be mostly cities. And they also thought that factories were quite unattractive. So they should be moved to the northern areas where there's already quite lots of nice, attractive areas. So it won't look too horrible. Whereas in the city, it's already quite populated. So factories were in the northern areas, which meant that when the decline of the manufacturing industries came because of automation and because of globalization, this meant that the northern areas were worse affected. Because imagine if you lived in a northern area, suddenly overnight all of the jobs would have been gone, whereas in southern areas, the jobs wouldn't have changed as much. There's a maximum of a 4-year difference in lifespan of some people living in the north to the south. Yeah, that is a really good fact to use. Well done. So there's a very high lifespan difference. And the reason why is because in these northern areas, there's actually um, very bad life expectancy because there's lower access to medical care, there's lower healthcare. And as more people are moving to urban areas, there's actually less healthcare professionals living there as well. It's a really good contribution. Okay. So we've talked about the effects of health. Thank you very much. Now, another effect is also wages. So people actually get paid much higher in southern areas and much lower, unfortunately, in northern areas. So it was actually found that the average weekly wage in an area called Huddersfield, which is in a northern area, so Huddersfield, was actually 40% lower than the wages of someone working in London. And that was just on a weekly basis. So on a weekly basis, they were getting 40% less. Okay, and the final disparity and evidence of the North-South divide is also education. So I know you guys are taking your GCSEs right now, but you might be able to see that there's actually a disparity in the GCSE results. GCSEs are actually much better and generally quite better in the south of England than it is in the north of England. And the reason why is because the south of England have more resources, more money, more access to things like that, whereas the north generally do not. Now, although we're talking about the evidence of the north-south divide in health, in wages, in education, it is important to say that sometimes there are exceptions, like in wealthy areas in the north, and there are southern areas that are deprived. But most of the UK follows this trend that there's actually worse health, worse wages, and worse education in the northern areas. Now, just moving on to the last part of this topic before we can move on to topic 2C. So, the last part of this topic is economic development in the UK. So, the government are really trying to resolve these regional differences. Okay. And there are different ways in which the government try to resolve these regional differences, and it might be helpful and beneficial for you to know three of them. So the first method is called devolving more powers. So what this just means is instead of having one central government that is located in London, controlling the whole of England, instead spreading out the power so that you have devolved governments, so that Scotland can manage themselves, Wales can manage themselves, Northern Ireland can manage themselves. And also powers can be devolved to local councils, like your local council might have a lot of power, for example. This then allows them to use money more effectively on schemes that they think are much more useful. This doesn't always work though. A second method is creating enterprise zones. So, around 50 enterprise zones have been created around England, Scotland, and Wales. Now, what happens is these enterprise zones are just areas of land, and the government gives people a range of benefits for locating in enterprise zones. Devolution in the UK started under Tony Blair's government under 1997. Thank you for that. That's a really good, interesting fact. You might use that in your geography, people. Okay, so take note. So, companies get a range of benefits from the government by having enterprise zones and moving to enterprise zones. So, things like reducing taxes or having planning rules, meaning that they pay lots of money, or financial benefits and improved infrastructure. So, what happens is these measures are used to ensure that companies can locate in these areas of high unemployment and bring jobs, bring income, which will help the north south divide. So, what the government does is, in order to resolve these regional differences, they cause companies to make the north area look really attractive, creating these enterprise zones so that companies, in order to get these benefits, they'll move to the northern areas and therefore reduce the north-south divide. Now, the final method is the northern powerhouse. Now, the Northern Powerhouse is the government's plan to reduce the inequality of the North South divide by attracting investment into the North and also. So, by improving the transport links between the northern cities, this then allows those people in the northern areas to be able to access those higher paid jobs in London. And also, there's a plan to include higher broadband, which means that there's higher coverage, and spend 70 million actually improving schools in the north as well. Now, some people criticize this as just a plan because it actually hasn't taken place yet, and it's more of a concept than an initiative that they will actually carry out. So, if you were to be asked in an exam situation, government resolve regional differences, say devolving more power, which means allowing the governments to spread out their power, creating enterprise zones, and which means that making these areas really attractive to businesses, and the northern powerhouse, which reduces inequality. What topic is this? So, it's funny, in paper two. There's topic 2A, 2B, and 2C. So we've covered 2A and 2B, and we're now moving on to 2C. So this might be a good time for you to join or continue watching. It's up to you. You might want to watch this from the beginning. Also, in this live stream, we're not covering the case studies or examples. I'll make a separate videos for that because I know you guys want to have more concise video. So we're just covering the content in this video. Okay. Let me quickly post that in the chat so future people can see. 1 second. So case studies and examples will be found in a future video. Okay, let's move on to topic 2C. So topic 2C is resource management. So this is obviously a bit of an odd topic in the geography spec. In comparison to all of the other things, this is probably the least geography-like. But some people find it also the most fun as well. So depending on what your school does, because I can break this topic down. So in this topic, your school either does food, water, or energy. So your school obviously firstly covers resource management, which is the first subtopic, but your school either covers food, water, and energy. Now, you all learn a little bit about each of the three, but you focus on one of them. So in this live stream, I'm going to focus on food. Although if you do cover water or energy in your school, then I have made videos for you, so you can actually just go onto the geography playlist and check those out. And you might want to leave the live stream if you don't cover food. But yes, unfortunately, we won't be looking at water or energy. We'll be just looking at resource management and food. Typically, some people say food is the easiest because water and energy is a bit more difficult to understand, but it's up to you. And also, you don't necessarily have to do the one your school taught you. If you feel more comfortable with another topic, then feel free to move. Okay, so let's cover resource management firstly. So, resources. Resources are things like food, water, and energy. So, resources can be defined as things that are needed for basic human development. They're necessary. Now, access to the resources of food, water, and energy are part of people's affect the economic and social well-being of different people in different countries. So, food, water, and energy. Now, as I said, we all need to learn a little bit about each of them because that's part of the first topic, but then you'll hone in onto one of them. So, just a little bit we need to learn on each of them. Food. So, when loads of people cannot access nutritious food, and also that means that they can't eat the right balance of nutrients. So, malnourishment is when people are unable to receive the right amount of nutrients in their diet because they are not balanced. They don't have a balanced nutrient diet. Now, malnourishment also includes undernourishment. So don't get confused with the two. So undernourishment tends to be less severe. So actually, no, sorry, malnourishment is less severe. So malnourishment is when you're not getting enough nutrients, and undernourishment is when you're not getting any food of any kind. So just going over that one more time so people are not confused. So malnourishment is when you're unable to retrieve nutrients, and undernourishment is when you're unable to retrieve food. So obviously undernourishment has some devastating effects such as starvation, and Malnourishment also has some bad effects, like it can limit children's development, causing stunted growth. Don't get confused with biology's nutrients here. Um, it can cause things like iron deficiency, and it can actually cause people to get ill. Now, one third of all under fives die from diseases linked to malnourishment. So that is actually a massive amount of under 5-year-olds. So one third of the world's children that are under 5 years old die from malnourishment. That is a massive amount and shows how impactful malnourishment is. Okay, now going on to water. So people need to have access to clean, safe drinking water, cooking water, and washing water. So sometimes the drinking water is referred to as potable or potable water. So this just means drinking water, as you should probably know from chemistry paper 2. So without proper sanitation, these water sources, like fresh water sources, can actually get polluted. Now, it can get polluted by things such as sewage, and this can therefore cause things like diseases. So, these diseases are referred to as waterborne diseases. Things like typhus and dysentery. They kill a lot of people every single year, and water is also needed to produce food as well. So, irrigation systems and things like that. And finally, energy. So, countries need energy for things like industry and transport, as well as for use in homes as well. But it's not necessarily needed for homes. It's more focused, in terms of low income countries, it's more focused in industry and transport. Now, electricity can allow countries to develop their industry, creating jobs and creating wealth. So, just by having access to electricity, this means that high income countries can ensure that they can develop their industry. Because remember, quaternary sectors are the most highest earning sectors, and this is all about tech. So, tech is the most highest earning industry, and therefore, countries that are ensuring that they can have loads of electricity, it then creates more wealth. Now, lifestyles in high income countries therefore also depend on energy. So we've become this modern society in which our lifestyles literally depend on our energy resource and how we can communicate with our family and communicate with different people across the world. Now, without electricity, the people in lower income countries and newly emerging economies are deprived of the same resources, such as YouTube, such as Google, which other people are. Now, burning wood is how a lot of these countries have energy, especially the countries that don't tend to have natural energy resources such as oil. They'll have to refer to burning wood. And obviously, burning wood isn't good for the environment by releasing fossil fuels. Um, Often, the technique of burning them using kerosene is used, and these create very harmful fumes, and it also adds to deforestation. Now, any lack of each of these three resources can have a massive effect on a person's ability to attend school or to attend work. Therefore, this can prevent people from learning or earning money or improving their country's economy. So you can see the knock on effects of these three resources. Now, unfortunately, the global supply of consumption and supply is unequal. So, what that means is that the countries that consume the most are not necessarily the countries that um, need the most supply. So it's very uneven. So what this means is that some countries don't even have their own energy reserves, for example, and others have dry climates or environments that are not suitable for food production. And therefore, this means that to access more resources, some countries have to rely on more of imports, which is more expensive, such as the UK. Because the UK's climate is not necessarily the best during winter for food, we have to rely on loads of imports, which is expensive, which may be a reason why food is more expensive in the UK. Therefore, the consumption of resources depends on a country's wealth. So, consumption depends upon a country's wealth, and the supply literally depends on luck. Like, has it got a good climate? Has it got fertile soil? And has it got like an agricultural industry? Now, we need to look at supply and consumption in different ways. So, in high income countries, in low income countries, and in newly emerging economies. So, countries is generally much greater. So, for example, in the UK, we tend to consume more. And the reason why we consume more is because we can afford to buy more, and we can afford to buy more food and have a higher standard of living. Now, unfortunately, because of a higher consumption rates, we also have very high wastage rates as well. Now, in low income countries, it's practically the opposite. So, in low income countries, the consumption is much lower. So, they have a quite low consumption. Not necessarily all low income countries have low consumption, but generally speaking, consumption is lower, mainly because they cannot afford to exploit their available resources or import. So, importing is too expensive, and they cannot afford to exploit the energy resources because it's too expensive to get the materials. Okay, but what about newly emerging economies? Do you think that they have a high consumption or a high supply? What do you think? Okay, so let me tell you. So, in newly emerging economies, as with their economy, the consumption is increasing. The consumption is increasing because, in terms of industry, so as areas such as China, as their industry develops really quickly, which requires lots of energy, the population and wealth are increasing rapidly as well. So let me just put that into writing for you. So, in newly emerging economies, because the industry is developing at a very, very rapid pace, this then means that more energy is needed because the industry relies on energy to work, generally speaking. And this then means that because there's more energy needed, that then means the wealth also increases as well. Because they're getting more resources, they're getting more energy, so that people and homes have more access to energy as well. Okay, now going back to the three resources we've looked at: food, water. Look for each of them at the demand and the supply and consumption and things like that, all key factors, before we go into our main topic of food. So, in terms of food in the UK, different types of food are becoming popular. So, food in the UK. In the UK, different types of food is becoming popular. So, before the 1960s, most of the fruit and most of the vegetables on sale in the UK were locally produced. So, pre 1960, everything was locally produced. But what do you think happened? Do you think we continue to have locally produced now? Well, Oh, and also you need to know locally produced and also seasonal, which means that it's the food that's produced in that season. So you wouldn't be receiving um, strawberries during the height of winter because they wouldn't necessarily grow. Now, now our food is so post 1960, our food is much different. So we tend to have three main things. Firstly, high value food. You also have seasonal products, and you also have organic products. So, high value foods includes things such as more exotic fruits and vegetables. For example, how in the UK you might see a mango, for example, in your local supermarket. Now, this is necessarily this is definitely not from the UK, and it means that it's been exported to the UK and it's grown in normally low income countries and newly emerging economies, things like spices and coffee and other things like that. Now, seasonal products are only available during the month that it grows, but right now in the UK, we tend to get fruit and vegetable that's imported to meet the demands for the seasonal produce all year round. So we have seasonal produce all year because all year you can have access to strawberries when necessarily they wouldn't be growing in the UK. And finally, organic products. So, organic produce means that because people are becoming more concerned about our environmental impact from food production, it's learning about how chemicals can affect health, and as organic products are very strictly regulated, which means there's no artificial fertilizers. And if you look at organic eggs and organic milk, there's nothing about the chickens being, for example, or the chickens or the cows being restricted in their environment. People feel better about buying organic produce. But the issue again is that lots of organic produce is imported. Now, when we're looking at food in the UK, you need to think about our carbon footprint. Now, the carbon footprint of our food is only growing. Because we're growing, processing, and packaging food, this all produces the common issue, which is carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is really bad because up to 10% of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions came directly from one culprit: agriculture. So, a lot of the UK's carbon footprint comes from agriculture and food, which just shows its massive impact. So, why is there a massive impact? Well, when we have food, you've got the transporting. Now, since most of our food comes from abroad and is imported into the UK, this means that the greater the distance, the more the carbon footprint is. And the distance is actually called food miles because it's the distance that the food has to travel before reaching your plate. And the greater it is, so the further countries it comes from, the worse impact it has and the bigger the carbon dioxide produced and the bigger the carbon footprint. Now, the amount of greenhouse gas produced whilst growing as well. So, whilst growing, packing, and transporting is called the carbon footprint. So, a larger carbon footprint means that more greenhouse gases. So, growing, transporting, and packing, and transporting, sorry. The amount of carbon dioxide that growing, packing, and transporting release is called the carbon footprint. And therefore, a bigger carbon footprint means it's worse off. So people are becoming more aware of this environmental issue and therefore are emphasizing on having local sources and packing food and getting local sources of food. Now, farming is becoming much more industrialized. So, since the 1960s, there has been a growth of agribuses. So, agribuses are these large scale, massive farms um, where all of the processes are happening. So, everything from the production of the seeds to the packaging of the food. And this means that farms in the UK have been changing. So, because the farm sizes has increased, this means that many small farms have been taken over and that the food can be produced more cheaply. The amount of chemicals used in food production has been increasing. So, we've been only having more fertilizers and pesticides. Now, the number of workers employed actually has fallen because of the use of machinery in planting and harvesting. Now, I'm going to be as quick as possible, as quick as I can, because I realize that lots of people also have to go. So, I'll probably try and wrap this live stream up at 5:30. So I'm going to hurry up and finish this. Okay. But thank you for being with me, everyone. So, managing the UK's water. The demand for water varies across the UK, and unfortunately, the areas that produce the most water are not the areas that need the most. So, what this then causes is areas of water surplus in the UK and areas of water deficit. So areas of water surplus means there's more water than they need in that area, and areas of water deficit therefore means there's less water. So surplus is when the supply for the water is greater than the demand. And obviously you have the opposite here. Deficit is when the supply is less than the demand, meaning it needs more water. So in the UK, the north and the west tend to be areas of water surplus. They have lots of rainfall and therefore the water is not necessarily in demand. Whereas in the southeast and the Midlands, these tend to face greater and hotter temperatures, and therefore, and also because of the high population densities as well, there is a higher demand for water. So in the north and west, there's higher rainfall, which causes a surplus, and in the southern areas and Midlands, there's higher demand because of the higher population. Now, overall, over time, the demand for water has been increasing. So since 1975, the use of water has only increased in the household because things like dishwashers, washing machines, which use a lot of water, the appliances use 70% more water now than they did before, and we think they're becoming more efficient. Now, the UK population as well is only predicted to increase by 6 million by 2040. And this then means that it will be roughly a total of 73 million. And because of this, that means that more people are going to need water, and population densities are also changing. So there are plans to build lots of homes in the southeast. But does this make sense considering there's areas of water deficit? So why build in an area that doesn't have much water? Now, water pollution is another issue. So water pollution doesn't necessarily affect the UK, but other countries. So it's just when there's polluted water, and the reason why is it could be things like fertilizers that accidentally wash up in the rivers and the groundwater, or it could be things from vehicles, so pollutants from vehicles that are washed into the water, or chemicals and oil spills, or it can be purposely done as well out of spite. Now, although we didn't tend to think of this as a major problem, in England it actually is. So it isn't too much of a problem. So in the UK, in England as well, specifically England, 80% of the water comes from groundwater. So that means water that's found below the surface. And pollution, however, affects the water's quality because nearly 50% of this groundwater is polluted. So therefore, it requires more processes in order to cleanse and purify the water, which we looked at in our chemistry paper 2 live stream. So We then need strategies to manage this water quality, and this includes things such as improving drainage systems, imposing regulations, and limiting the fertilizers and pesticides used. Water transfers are also used. So we talked about areas of water surplus and water deficit. Now you may just think, oh, we can easily solve that by transferring the water from the northern areas to the southern areas where there's surplus to deficit. But there's a lot of this is very expensive because it requires lots of pipes and aqueducts and dams, and also there's a lot of political issues because there's tensions between the northern and southern areas, and they don't want to give the water away. Okay, and finally, energy. So the energy usage has changed in the UK. So where's our energy topic? There. So we talked about how energy is needed for industry, and in a developing industry, more energy is used. So in UK, the energy mix has changed. So traditionally, we relied on 91% of our energy being coal and oil. So key facts here. 91% of our energy was coal and oil. So you could just say, then we progressed on gas reserves because we found some in the Northern Sea. This meant that by 1980, 22% was actually supplied by gas. So in 1980, we saw 22% supplied by gas. This isn't actually needed, one second. And then in recently, obviously, there's been a shift to renewable energy resources, and therefore there's been a ban on coal-fired power stations, and they're all due to close by 2025. And 19% of all electricity is going to be renewable energy. And in 2019, 19% of all energy was renewable. Now, the UK's supplies of coal, oil, and gas are all running out. The North Sea's oil and gas reserves are being swiftly used up, and production has been declining since 2000. The UK still has coal reserves, but the coal production has significantly decreased. So there's been a shift. So we went from coal and oil to gas to renewable resources. Now, exploiting these energy resources can cause economic and environmental issues. So, obviously, environmental issues in the fact that it's burning carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. Fracking can pollute groundwater. Accidents such as oil spills causes chemicals to leak into the water. Again, water pollution. Natural ecosystems can be damaged, and power stations and wind farms are often considered visual pollution as well. Economic issues. So, fossil fuels are actually quite expensive, and the North Sea oil is especially expensive to produce. The cost to the consumer of electricity from nuclear and renewable energy is actually quite high, and money is actually needed for this research into alternative energy resources. Okay, now the final topic, I'm going to just quickly whiz through this one. Food. So, we're going to go over food. So the global supply of food is uneven, unfortunately. So as we talked about water, the amount of food that countries produce varies. However, the countries that produce the most amount of food are not the countries that necessarily eat the most, and the countries that need the most food aren't the countries that eat the most food. So you can see that in my previous video about the global demand for food, you will see the maps, and it just showed how North America and East Asia actually produce a lot of food. However, Central America and Africa produce very little amounts of food. And in terms of consumption, high-income countries such as the USA eat a lot because of the high standard of living, whereas low-income countries consume much less, and newly emerging economies are on their way to consuming more. So, a key definition here that you need to know about is food security. So, food security is when people are able to eat enough nutrients to stay healthy. So, we talked about malnutrition when you're not getting enough nutrients. So, food security is opposite when you are gaining enough nutrients to be healthy. Now, food insecurity is when people can't get enough food to stay healthy or to stay active. So countries don't grow enough to feed their population can't afford it. So global food consumption is therefore increasing, and there are two main reasons, the first being rising population and the second being economic development. So global population is obviously increasing, and the second reason is because of economic development. This means that people have more disposable income and spend it more on food. Now, food insecurity, food supply is actually affected by both physical and human factors. So physical factors include things such as climate. Countries with climates that are unsuitable therefore cannot grow as much. Also, water stress. Food supply relies a lot on water. And finally, pests and diseases. And then you also see human factors. So things such as poverty. You're unable to afford the food. Um, they often don't have their own land to grow food as well, which affects their ability to farm. And also, they can't have access to fertilizers and things like that, and pesticides. Technology, which is similar enough. So they don't have because of the mechanization of equipment. This means that farms are more efficient, which increases yield. And finally, conflict, which just means that some countries have damaged agricultural land, making it very toxic and unsafe. Now, food insecurity has loads of negative impacts. We looked at undernutrition, which is when people are unable to get any food to survive, and therefore it can cause developmental problems such as stunted growth, and we can see this in sub-Saharan Africa. Famine, which is a serious lack of food across a large area, which can lead to starvation and death. Soil erosion, which just means it's less fertile, so it can't produce as much food. Rising prices, and it can cause social unrest as well. So, ways to increase food production you need to learn about, and then you need to learn about sustainable food supply. So, ways to increase food production. So, you've got irrigation systems. So, to increase food supply, irrigation. And irrigation involves artificially watering the land. So it can be used to make drier areas much more productive, increase the harvest. So there's different ways: gravity flow, sprinklers, drip systems, etc. Another method is hydroponics and aeroponics. So hydroponics are methods and aeroponics are methods of growing plants without soil. So this could be hydroponics where it's just in a nutrient solution, so practically just similar to water, and aeroponics when they're just suspended in air and the water containing the nutrients is just sprayed at them and it's then recycled, so there's less wastage. You also have biotechnology. So biotechnology is genetically engineering the crops, so things like GM crops, genetically modified crops, to be resistant to drought, higher yields, higher nutritional value, making sure that they're ethical, making sure that they have lots of variety. Now, the new green revolution aims to increase yields of sustainable methods, including GM crops and also traditional and organic farm methods, such as finally appropriate technology. So high-tech methods like hydroponics and GM crops can be quite expensive. So having things that will help the locals, such as drip irrigation systems, which helps and is more appropriate. Planting a variety of species, having individual wells. In terms of sustainable food supply, so having an increased food supply is different to having sustainable. Sustainable means that it can be used for a long period of time. Okay, sorry. My pen is running out a little bit. So sustainable food supply. And having an increased sustainable food supply is reliant on things like organic farming without pesticides, and using natural processes to return the nutrients to the soil so that the crops can continue to be grown. Because of the fact that when you have artificial herbicides, artificial pesticides, they are restricted and animals aren't given any extra supplements and things like that. Then you have permaculture. So permaculture aims to produce a way that recreates these natural ecosystems, and permaculture is really useful for protecting soil, and they're very low maintenance as well. And finally, urban farming initiatives. So urban farming initiatives are important because they use things like empty spaces to grow things like balconies, to grow food and raise animals in towns. And we can definitely see this in London, and it makes areas more healthier, more attractive, and green spaces also improves. Now, eating seasonally as well and reducing waste is very useful. So, fish and meat from sustainable sources. So, fish species are at risk of overfishing. Raising animals for meat is bad for the environment. Seasonable food consumption, only eating from the season you're in, and finally, reduced waste. So, globally, 1/3 of food produced is actually wasted. So, schemes like Think, Eat, Save, and Love Food, Hate Waste encourage individuals to help each other. Now, that marks the end of this topic. So, we've gone through every single content in Geography Paper 2. So, thank you for watching all the way through, some of you, and thank you for watching for others. And I will be releasing a case study and examples in paper 2 like I did one. So if you find that useful, do chat and tell me below. But thank you again for watching, and see you soon.